Have you ever seen an entire town change? Because one quiet stranger refused to back down. What started as a simple coffee break turned into a showdown no one saw coming, where fear met its match, and justice walked in wearing a dusty coat. Before we dive into this unforgettable story, don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Your support gives us the fuel to bring you more powerful stories like this one. The sun was dipping low behind the ridges outside a small Arizona town, casting long, lazy shadows across the dusty parking lot of a diner that had seen better days. The sign out front blinked with a tired rhythm, flickering like it wasn't sure if it wanted to stay lit or just give up altogether. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of fried onions and overbrewed coffee, clinging to every corner of the worn-out booths and scuffed linoleum. It was the kind of place where regulars kept their heads down, stuck to their same orders, and didn't ask too many questions. Most nights passed in quiet murmurs and the occasional scrape of a coffee cup across ceramic. But tonight, that quiet had a crack in it. At the far end of the diner, 3 men filled 2 booths like they owned the place. The Reapers, folks called them, leather vests, loud voices, and an ugliness that wasn't just on the outside. Their laughter rolled like thunder across the room, rough and sharp enough to cut. They'd been coming around more lately, riding through town like it owed them something. Rex was their mouthpiece, built like an old oak and just as stubborn, with a sneer that didn't leave his face unless it was replaced with a snarl. He leaned back in his seat, one boot propped on the edge of the table, fingers drumming a bottle of beer. The way he watched the room made folks uncomfortable, like he was always waiting for someone to blink wrong just so he could have a reason. Sophie, the young waitress, moved from table to table with a quiet kind of grace, her smile polite but never reaching her eyes. She couldn't have been more than 25, her apron tied a little too tight, her ponytail pulled back like she was holding herself together one strand at a time. She paused when she reached the Reaper's table. "Well, hey there, sweetheart," Rex drawled, voice slick like old motor oil. "You just gonna walk past without saying hi to your favorite customers?" She didn't respond, just placed a coffee pot on the table with practiced care. One of the other bikers gave a low whistle, making her flinch. Rex chuckled and reached out, not quite grabbing her arm, but close enough to make it clear he could if he wanted to. "Now, don't be shy," he said. "Ain't polite to ignore a man when he's speaking?" The diner's manager, a tired man named Carl, who'd worked there since the Reagan administration, caught Sophie's eye from the back counter and shook his head just slightly. A silent plea, just let it go. Sophie forced a smile and stepped away. The other patrons kept their eyes down. One older man in a trucker cap shifted in his seat like he might say something, but then he didn't. Then the door opened. It wasn't loud, just the quiet jingle of the bell above the frame, but it was enough to pause the conversation. A man stepped in, tall, lean, wearing a dust-colored coat and black slacks. He didn't look around or hesitate. He just walked with steady steps toward the booth in the back, furthest from the door. He sat down, removed his coat, and placed it beside him. No fanfare, no announcement, just calm. There was something about him, though. Folks couldn't put their finger on it, but the air seemed to shift slightly, like how the wind changes right before a storm hits. Sophie made her way over and offered him a cup of coffee. He nodded once. "Black, please." That was it. He didn't ask about the menu, he didn't make small talk. He just sat, hands resting on the table, eyes steady, Rex noticed. Of course he did. "Well, look what the wind blew in," he said, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "Another loner trying to play cowboy." No reaction. Rex stood up, beer still in hand, and ambled over. He stopped at the edge of the stranger's booth, leaned in a little. "You deaf or just rude?" The man didn't look up. He turned a page in the menu like he had all the time in the world. "Hey!" Rex's voice edged up. "I'm talking to you, Gramps." Nothing. Rex let out a barking laugh and looked over his shoulder at his crew. Maybe he's too old to hear me. Or maybe he thinks he's better than us. He leaned closer. His beer tipped forward, just slightly enough to spill a dark stream of liquid onto the table and down into the stranger's lap. The diner went still. The man looked down at the spill. Then slowly he pulled a napkin from the dispenser and dabbed at his pants. No rush, no glare, no anger. Finally he looked up. His voice wasn't loud, but it landed like a hammer. "You've got two choices," he said, voice level. "You walk out, or you get carried out." Rex blinked. There was a shift in the room, so small most wouldn't notice it. But the bikers did, and so did Sophie. It wasn't the words. It was the way he said them. Like a man who had seen this kind of moment more times than he could count, like he wasn't making a threat. He was making a promise. Rex laughed again, but it sounded thinner now. "You serious?" he said, stepping back with a shake of his head. "Man thinks he's in some action movie." The stranger looked down again at the menu, turned one more page. For the first time in a long time, Rex didn't know what to say next, and that silence? That was louder than any shout could have been. There was a stillness in the room that didn't quite feel natural, the kind of quiet that hums in your ears, makes your skin crawl, like nature herself is waiting to see who blinks first. Rex didn't blink. With the kind of recklessness only wounded pride can stir up, he took a full step forward, lifted his arm, and swung a heavy punch toward the man in the booth. It wasn't pretty, but it had weight behind it, enough to put most men down. Only it never landed. John moved so smoothly it barely registered until it was over. One moment he was seated. The next he was standing, sidestepping, and catching Rex's arm midair like it was part of a dance. Then, with a simple shift of balance, John twisted and sent Rex crashing to the floor with a thud that echoed across the diner like a warning shot. Gasps rang out. A plate slid off a table and shattered near the counter. Someone knocked over a chair trying to get away. Even the jukebox stopped mid-song, its motor wheezing out a confused hum before falling silent. John didn't speak. He didn't gloat. He just stepped back and looked down at the man now groaning at his feet. Rex rolled onto his side, face flushed with something between rage and disbelief. He pushed himself up slowly, his boots squeaking against the worn linoleum. That was when the rest of the Reapers stood, all 5 of them. Big, broad, and pissed. They hadn't expected to need to back Rex up tonight. Usually the man didn't need help, but now? Now things felt different. John didn't posture or puff out his chest. He didn't grab a chair or raise his fist like he was in a bar brawl. He just shifted his weight slightly, like a man getting ready to step into a pair of old shoes. The first biker lunged. John met him head-on, deflecting his grab with a wrist lock that spun the man around and sent him stumbling into a booth. Before he could recover, John guided him down to the floor with a firm shove between the shoulder blades. Clean, quick. The second tried to flank him, but John turned into the motion, pivoting on the balls of his feet. He spun low and delivered a kick straight to the man's chest, knocking him into the napkin holder and rattling the cutlery on nearby tables. The third was faster. He came in from the side, aiming a hard elbow toward John's head, but John ducked beneath it, hooked a hand around the biker's waist, and drove his knee sharply into the man's ribs. A grunt burst from the man's mouth as he bent forward, only to be finished off with a knee to the leg that dropped him to the floor like a sack of cement. By now, the room was chaos. Dishes scattered, chairs knocked over, folks scrambling out of booths with their hands up or their mouths covered. And through it all, John moved with the same calm he'd had when he walked in. Not angry. Not even irritated. Just focused, measured. Betty, the older waitress, stood behind the counter gripping a coffee pot like it was the last thing keeping her grounded. Sophie stood beside her, wide-eyed, both hands pressed to her apron. For the first time in years, the fear in their faces started to shift, not completely gone, but flickering. Like maybe, just maybe, they weren't powerless anymore? Across the room, the remaining Reapers hesitated. One took a step forward, then stopped. Another looked to Rex, waiting. Rex, bleeding from his cheek and breathing heavy, pulled himself up by gripping the booth. His eyes were wild now, flashing from his men to John, then back again. "What are you waiting for?" He barked, voice hoarse. "Get him!" They didn't move right away. One, a tall man with tattoos down both arms, muttered, "This ain't worth it," before stepping back toward the door. John looked at the rest. "You've seen enough," he said, quiet but steady. "Walk away before you make this worse for yourselves." He wasn't bragging. He wasn't daring them. It was just truth. Like telling someone it's going to rain when you smell it in the air. A couple of them listened. They dropped their hands, stepped away from the circle they'd formed, but not Rex. He grabbed a crowbar that had somehow fallen near one of the booths left there, maybe by a worker fixing the heater earlier that weakened charged again. He didn't yell this time. He didn't need to. The weight of his shame drove him forward. John sidestepped the swing with ease, catching Rex's wrist in motion and twisting the bar free. With one precise motion, he brought his palm up under Rex's chest, lifting him just enough to throw him backward. Rex landed hard, his body splayed out in the middle of the aisle, the crowbar clattering across the floor beside him. And then silence, the kind of silence that comes after a thunderclap. John straightened his coat like he'd just stepped out of a gust of wind. He reached into his pocket and pulled out some folded bills, placing them carefully on the counter next to the cash register. "For the mess," he said softly to Betty. Sophie, her hands still shaking, rushed to the coffee pot and poured a fresh cup into a to-go cup. She stepped around the counter, hesitated, then held it out to him. He took it, offering a small nod. "Thank you," she said, her voice cracked. "Can I ask, who are you?" John paused, eyes meeting hers. "Just someone who's seen enough trouble to recognize it." He turned then, coat brushing the doorframe as he stepped out into the fading twilight. The door swung shut behind him with a soft click. Inside, the diner was in ruins, tables overturned, floor sticky with coffee, air thick with tension still settling. But something had changed, and no one could quite put it into words, not yet. They just knew that whatever grip the Reapers had on this town, it wasn't as strong as it had been an hour ago. A little ways outside of town, tucked behind a rusting fence and half covered by overgrown brush, sat a forgotten auto shop with a collapsed roof and paint peeling from its sign. No one came here anymore, not unless they were trying to stay hidden or blow off some steam without drawing too much attention. That's exactly why Rex had chosen it. The garage door was jammed open, just enough to let in the low orange light of a dying sunset. Inside, it was hot and still, the air thick with the scent of old motor oil, sweat, and something bitter, something that had less to do with the place and more with the people in it. The remaining Reapers were scattered across the space like the aftermath of a busted poker game. One sat on a stack of tires with an ice pack pressed to the side of his face. Another leaned against a toolbox, slowly wiping blood off his knuckles. Nobody said much. The silence wasn't restful. It was the kind that buzzed beneath the skin. Rex didn't sit. He paced. Back and forth across the stained concrete, boots thudding in rhythm with his ragged breathing. A cut on his cheek had scabbed over badly, and his left eye was still swollen from the blow that had put him on the floor. But it wasn't the pain in his body that had him walking in circles like a caged dog. It was the fire in his pride. Every time his mind looped back to the image of that man, standing over him with barely a hair out of place, the shame burned hotter. He stopped abruptly in front of the workbench and grabbed a wrench, slamming it down hard against the surface. Tools jumped. One of the guys flinched. "He made us look like fools," Rex growled. His voice cracked halfway through the sentence, not from injury, but from something deeper, something raw. Nobody answered. Then Jesse spoke. He was the youngest in the group, maybe 21, if that. Still had that unsure look in his eyes, like he hadn't quite figured out what kind of man he wanted to be yet. He shifted on the stool he was perched on, cleared his throat, and said, not loudly but loud enough, "Maybe we let this one go. That guy, he wasn't like the others." The air went even more still than before. Rex turned slowly. In 2 strides he was in front of Jesse, gripping the collar of his vest with one hand, yanking him up so their faces were nearly touching. "You want to run?" Rex hissed. "That what you're saying?" Jesse's jaw clenched, but his hands stayed at his sides. "I'm saying he's not someone we can just steamroll," Jesse said. "He didn't even try to hurt us unless he had to." Rex's grip tightened, but his knuckles were white, shaking just a little. His eyes darted from Jesse to the others who were all watching now, not stepping in, not stepping out either. Just watching, and that was the problem. Rex could feel it. The shift. He used to command their loyalty without question. Now they were waiting to see what he'd do next. Waiting to decide if they still followed him. He let go. Jesse stepped back, shoulders tense but still standing straight. Rex didn't speak for a long while after that. He just turned away and rubbed his jaw, his fingers pausing near the cut on his face. When he finally did speak, the words came low and cold. "We're not letting this go." He moved to the back of the shop, yanked open a battered metal cabinet, and pulled out a black duffel bag with a heavy clang. From it, he started pulling gear chains, gloves, crowbars, even a few bats. "This ain't about getting even," he said, voice rising. "This is about reminding people who runs this town. That guy? He humiliated us in front of everyone." He tossed a chain onto the ground. It coiled like a snake. He thought he could just walk away. He thought we wouldn't come back. He turned to face them, his face flushed and wild-eyed. "Tonight we make sure he doesn't get to think that again." One of the older reapers, Mac, with a scar down the side of his neck, spoke up, cautious. "You sure that's smart?" "He took us down quick, Rex, real quick." Rex's reply came sharp. "Then we don't go alone." He pulled out his phone, tapped through a few names, and put it to his ear. "Get the boys from Tucson. And Flagstaff too, if they're still breathin'. Tell 'em it's not a request. Tonight we ride." Back in town, the neon sign outside a roadside motel buzzed gently in the dark. The motel was the kind that hadn't been remodeled in 20 years, but it was clean and quiet, and for a man like John Wick, that was more than enough. Inside one of the corner rooms, the blinds were drawn. A single lamp lit the space in a soft yellow glow. John sat at the desk by the window, a cup of coffee cooling beside his elbow. He was leaning over a leather notebook, the kind that had clearly traveled with him for years. The spine was cracked, the edges worn from use. He flipped through pages slowly. Some were sketches, martial arts positions, footwork angles. Others were notes, phrases like breathing before action and distance is mercy. In the middle, tucked between two pages, was a photo. It showed a younger version of himself, standing beside an older man in a dojo. Both of them wore crisp uniforms, the master's arm draped lightly over John's shoulder. They looked peaceful, focused, like two men who understood that strength didn't need to shout. John stared at the photo for a long moment, thumb resting at the edge. He could still hear the old man's voice. "Power means knowing when not to use it. Control, that's the real fight." John closed the notebook and sat back. His hand moved to his side, where a shallow scrape marked where one of the bikers had tried to get lucky. He cleaned it gently, then leaned back in his chair. His thoughts drifted not to the fight, but to something much older, a memory of losing control, of letting anger lead instead of reason. It had cost him more than he ever expected. And it was why now, when things boiled over, he held himself in check. He wasn't afraid of violence. He was afraid of what it would turn him into. Outside, the wind picked up. A low hum filled the air, steady and growing. John stood and moved to the window, parting the blinds with 2 fingers. He didn't see much, just distant shapes and the soft glow of headlamps bouncing along the road. But the sound was unmistakable, motorcycles, several of them, coming fast. By the time the engines cut through the quiet night, the air had already turned. Not colder, exactly just heavier. Like the desert itself had paused to listen. The first headlight swung across the motel's faded parking lot, illuminating a patch of cracked pavement and a line of dented soda machines, then another, and another. In less than a minute, more than a dozen bikes rolled in, rumbling low like thunder moving slow across the land. Their riders wore the same reaper patches stitched to their backs, but these weren't the same bruised faces from earlier. These were new ones, reinforcements, bigger, meaner, louder. They didn't park in any kind of order. They just circled the lot like wolves tightening the ring. Motel guests peeked through their windows, curtains twitching like nervous hands. A dog barked from somewhere nearby, then stopped just as quickly. Rex stood at the front, crowbar in hand again, his face swollen from the last round, but his posture even more rigid. Whatever bruises he'd taken, they hadn't touched his ego. "Come on out, tough guy," he called, voice raw but loud. "Let's finish this." One of the motel doors cracked open, then slammed shut again. A second-floor window creaked as a woman pulled the blinds down tight. John didn't rush. He stepped out of his room with the same calm he'd shown inside that diner, zipping up his jacket as if he were heading out for an evening stroll instead of into a battlefield. His boots made soft thumps across the concrete as he walked toward the center of the lot. "Evening," he said, eyes sweeping across the crowd. Rex raised the crowbar, pointing it like an accusation. "You really thought we'd let you make a joke out of us?" John kept walking until he stood a few steps from Rex. "I gave you a choice," he said. "You picked this one." The Reapers tightened their circle, engines still pinging with heat. Someone revved a throttle, more for effect than anything else. They were waiting. Wanting to see a show? What they got instead was stillness? John's stance didn't scream threat, but something about the way he stood, shoulders loose and eyes level, made it hard to breathe. The first one lunged without warning, a heavy chain swinging wide in his hand. John ducked under the arc, caught the man's wrist mid-motion, and twisted. The chain clattered to the ground. Before the biker could recover, John drove his elbow hard into the man's ribs. The sound that came out of him was sharp and fast, and he dropped where he stood. Another came at him with a wooden bat, boots slamming hard against the gravel. John stepped into the swing instead of away from it, dodging under, then pivoted and landed a hard kick to the man's knee. The leg buckled with a pop. The bat bounced off the asphalt as the biker hit the ground groaning. Then came a flash of steel. A knife caught the light and darted toward John's side. But he was already moving, blocking with one arm, gripping the attacker's elbow with the other, and turning him into his own momentum. The biker's back slammed hard into the ground, air exploding from his lungs. It wasn't loud, it wasn't wild, it was clean. The whole courtyard became a flurry of motion boots, sliding, fists swinging, the crunch of bone against concrete. But even in the middle of it, John never looked rushed. He moved like water, flowing between strikes, ducking, countering, adjusting with the kind of control that only comes from years of discipline. No wasted energy, no fury, just pure focus. Dust kicked up in clouds around them, motel lights flickering overhead like they weren't sure whether to stay on or call it quits. Every sound, every thud, every grunt, every crash echoed off the walls of the cheap stucco building and into the stillness beyond. Jesse stood at the edge, fists clenched at his sides. He'd followed because he didn't know what else to do, because backing out felt like betrayal. But now, watching John fight, not just win, but hold back, something inside him twisted. This wasn't a guy trying to prove he was tougher than the rest. He wasn't taunting, he wasn't bragging, he was protecting. Jesse took a step forward. His hands shook, but he didn't raise them. John turned slightly, eyes meeting his. "You don't have to follow this," he said, voice calm but firm. "Not an order, an offer," Jesse swallowed. For a second he just stood there, breathing heavy. Then he dropped his arms to his sides and backed up, step by step, until he disappeared into the shadows. Rex saw him, and that was the final snap. "Coward!" he roared, rage boiling over. "You walk now, you're done." But Jesse didn't turn around. Rex turned his fury back toward John. With a roar, he charged, swinging the crowbar like a club. This wasn't a fight move. It was pure anger. John sidestepped the swing with ease, catching the wrist, twisting it hard. The crowbar hit the ground. Then John moved fast, fluid, precise. A sharp strike to the chest, a pivot into a back fist, and then a low sweep that knocked Rex flat. He landed hard, gasping, one arm twisted awkwardly beneath him. John crouched beside him. "You lost," he said softly. "The moment you chose pride over peace?" Rex didn't respond. He just lay there, panting, staring up at the night sky like it had betrayed him too. Around them, the fight ended. Some of the bikers moved to help Rex up, but their eyes darted around nervously. Others simply stepped away, dropping weapons as they went. A few tore off their Reaper patches and left them fluttering in the dust. A door creaked open, then another. Motel guests, quiet and careful, peered out into the aftermath. "Did he take them all?" Someone whispered. "He didn't just beat them," another murmured. "He broke them." John didn't answer. He didn't smile. He didn't even look proud. He just stood, brushed dust off his sleeves, and walked back toward his room. Behind him, the parking lot was quiet again, except now it wasn't fear holding it there. It was respect. The sun came up slow that morning, as if even the sky wasn't quite sure what had happened the night before. Its pale light crept over rooftops, spilled across cracked sidewalks, and stretched into alleyways where the shadows still lingered like old secrets. In front of the motel, the parking lot was a quiet mess, gravel scattered, a few bloodied rags, and one boot left behind like a story half-finished. A couple of glass bottles lay broken near the soda machine, their contents long evaporated into the warm desert air. John sat alone on a bench near the edge of the lot, one hand curled around a paper cup of coffee, the other resting lightly on his knee. His jacket was zipped and his face unreadable, though his eyes moved slowly, scanning the horizon like a man who expected something but wasn't in a rush to meet it. The motel clerk, a wiry man named Eli who had worked that front desk longer than most travelers spent in town, stepped outside. He held a cigarette in one hand but didn't light it. "You're still here," Eli said, his voice cautious but not unkind. John nodded, took a sip. Eli glanced at the battered pavement, then at the man who had made it that way. "So, what now?" John looked straight ahead. "They won't be back," he said simply. There was something final in the way he said it, not a boast, not a warning, just fact. Eli stood beside him in silence for a few moments, cigarette still tucked between his fingers, untouched. Then he gave a single nod and turned back inside. Elsewhere, the town was waking up to something new. The first real stirrings came at the diner. Betty had arrived just after 6, keys in hand, apron already tied around her waist. Sophie followed her in quietly, glancing around the place as if expecting to find it the way they'd left, a mess of broken chairs, smashed cups, and the echo of angry laughter. But someone had cleaned. Maybe the motel manager, maybe someone from the town who'd seen enough and wanted to help. Whatever the reason, the floor was swept, and the booth cushions had been wiped down. Betty flipped on the coffee maker. It sputtered to life, gurgling like it was waking up too. By 7:30, the first customers trickled in, then a few more. Some just stood near the counter, not even ordering, just talking, hushed and cautious at first, like they were testing the water. "Did you hear what happened?" A trucker whispered to a mechanic at the counter. "They say he took 'em all down, like all of them." "No way one man did that, not like they say." "You didn't see it? You don't know." Outside, someone posted a blurry video taken from behind a window. It spread faster than yesterday's headlines. The town's tiny radio station picked it up and ran with it. "Local troublemakers run out by lone stranger." By midday, the tone had changed. The disbelief had shifted into something else. For the first time in a long while, folks weren't whispering out of fear. They were wondering out loud. They were talking like people who had just remembered they had voices. Around 11, the bell above the diner door chimed. Heads turned. Jesse stood in the entrance. He looked younger than he had the night before, which was strange, considering the bruise blooming on his jaw and the cut across his cheek. Maybe it was the way he stood, straighter, less like someone trying to puff up and more like someone who decided not to hide anymore. He walked to the counter. Sophie met him there. "Coffee?" she asked. He nodded. "Please." She poured a cup and slid it across. Jesse held it in both hands for a while before speaking. "I think I'm done with them," he said, almost too soft to hear. Betty had paused mid-step. She stood there for a second, then walked to the coffee pot and topped off his cup without saying a word. But Sophie gave him a nod, small, but full of meaning. Jesse looked out the window at the street, where the road stretched flat and empty under the early afternoon sun. "I saw what real strength looks like last night," he said. "And it ain't fear." That quiet landed heavy, but not in a bad way. More like something important had just been said, and nobody wanted to mess it up with words too soon. A few blocks over, Sheriff Wallace pulled his cruiser into a space near the motel. He sat there for a moment before getting out. He hadn't shown up the night before. He hadn't shown up the week before that either. And everybody in town knew it. John was sitting near the same spot he had been that morning. The cup was gone, but the posture hadn't changed. Wallace walked up slowly, his hand resting on his belt. "I should have done more," he said, voice low. John turned his head slightly, met his gaze. "You still can," he replied. "People are watching now." That stuck with Wallace more than he wanted it to. He gave a short nod, then walked back to his car without saying anything else. By late afternoon, the town was different in ways that couldn't quite be explained on paper. The hardware store had taken down the barred windows they'd put up a year ago. The barber left his door open instead of locking it between cuts. At the gas station, the owner told a couple bikers that their money wasn't good there anymore. More than anything, it was in the way people looked at each other. The sideways glances were still there, but now they came with half smiles, hesitant nods, the kind of gestures that said, "Maybe we're not alone." The sheriff started making calls, not arrests, not yet, but enough to get folks talking, enough to let the Reapers know they weren't untouchable anymore. A couple of their usual hangouts shut down early. One guy got picked up for questioning, and for the first time in a long while, no one looked the other way. John didn't stay in the middle of it. He watched from the edge, like a man watching a garden begin to grow after a long drought, not his to tend, but something he'd helped make possible. That evening, he opened his notebook again. It fell open to a page with a quote written in faded ink. "You may never get thanks for the fights you prevent, but that's the price of knowing how to end them." He stared at it for a long time. Then he closed the book and looked out at the road beyond the parking lot, where the sun was slipping low again, the sky streaked in quiet orange. Evening settled over the town like a warm, quiet blanket. Not heavy, not brooding, just still. There was a gentleness in the air, the kind that only follows after a long storm finally passes. Light flickered through windows, radios hummed soft tunes behind screen doors, and the streets were strangely, wonderfully uneventful. But not every corner of town shared that peace. Behind the diner, where the dumpsters lined a narrow gravel alleyway, Jesse leaned against the back wall. He'd taken the trash out without being asked old habits dying hard. He lit a cigarette but didn't smoke it, just let it burn slowly between his fingers as he stared at the sky going lavender. Footsteps scraped against the gravel. He didn't flinch, he already knew. Rex stepped into the alley from the shadows like a man held together by pride and duct tape. His eye was swollen half shut, and his mouth still bore a purple bruise from the motel. But the pain hadn't cooled him down, it had curdled into something darker. Desperation, spite. "You think this is over?" Rex growled, voice strained. "You think I'm just gonna disappear because some outsider gave you a spine?" Jesse dropped the cigarette and stepped on it. "You lost," he said evenly. "Everybody sees it but you." Rex's lip curled. "You ungrateful little—" "You tried to make fear a currency in a place where people were already broke," Jesse said, stepping forward. "That guy didn't just beat you. He showed us we didn't have to bow to anyone anymore." Rex moved as if to close the gap, but something held him back. The unsteady set of his feet, the rawness of the truth. He looked smaller now, not because of the bruises, because there was nothing left behind the bark. Then a voice slid through the alley like a whisper carried on gravel. "Step away from him." Rex froze. Jesse turned his head. John stood at the alley's mouth, hands in his coat pockets, face half lit by the dim light above the back door. No rage, no threat. Just present, steady as a heartbeat, undeniable as gravity. Rex turned slowly. He didn't speak. His breath caught like he'd walked into a memory he didn't want to relive. John stepped forward, not fast, not dramatic. "Just close enough. You've had your chances," he said, quiet but sharp. "Don't waste this one." Rex's jaw twitched. For a heartbeat, it looked like he might go for something, anything, but then his eyes dropped. He didn't nod, he didn't speak, he just backed away. The further he walked, the more the air seemed to forget him, and then he was gone. Back inside, the diner hummed with soft, noise-clinking silverware, old country on the jukebox, and the smell of something warm on the griddle. John stepped through the door. Betty met him at the counter with a paper bag and a coffee to go. Her hands were steady now. They hadn't been that way in a long time. "Turkey with sharp cheddar." "Black coffee, like always," she said, pushing the bag toward him. "Figured you might be heading out." John took the bag and nodded his thanks. He didn't reach for words. He rarely did. Sophie approached slowly, wiping her hands on a towel. "Where will you go now?" He looked at her, then out the front window, where the road stretched west like a question waiting for someone brave enough to answer. "Wherever trouble thinks it's safe," he said, his voice carrying just a trace of something lighter than usual. She smiled, not wide, not giddy, just honest. He tipped his head and walked out. Later that week, the town began to shift in ways small and significant. At the community center, a new flyer went up. "Intro to Self-Defense, Saturdays at 10, first class free." A kid named Aaron, barely old enough to tie his own belt, stepped into the dojo with nervous eyes and a fierce kind of hope. Jesse started pumping gas at Rydell's station across from the grocery. He worked quiet, wiped windows without being asked, and didn't say much unless it mattered. People noticed. Sheriff Wallace put a handwritten sign on the front of his office door, just 6 words: "Zero tolerance for intimidation." From anyone, the Reapers didn't show their faces again. Not all at once. Not in a way anyone marked with headlines or loud declarations, but gradually the memory of them faded. In their place, folks found their voices again, found each other, and John? He didn't stay for thanks. He walked down the shoulder of the highway, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder, coat flaring gently behind him in the evening breeze. His figure was a silhouette against the sky orange and violet blending into dusk. With every step, dust rose, hung in the air, then settled. No destination, just a direction. Somewhere far off, a truck passed, engine humming low. The driver glanced out and saw him just a man walking west, steady and alone. The kind of man who made you sit up a little straighter, even if you didn't know why. A quiet voice echoed inside John's thoughts, something old and worn, but never forgotten. Justice doesn't need applause. It just needs someone willing to walk alone until others learn to stand, and so he walked. Some folks think strength is about who shouts the loudest or swings the hardest, but maybe, just maybe, real strength shows up in the quiet moments, when someone chooses restraint over revenge, dignity over domination. What do you think? Can one act of courage truly change a town or even a life? If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Covert Truths so you won't miss the next story where justice doesn't always arrive with a badge, but sometimes with dusty boots and a calm voice.